Hi, this week is not a long chapter. It is chapter 7 on traditional literature. And we've actually been talking about this already, but you will see this on pages 95 to 102 in your textbook. And from pages 102 to 106 are some really good lists of all the different kinds of traditional literature that are out there. The kind of cool thing about traditional literature is that all of the stories in traditional literature comes from stories or even poems that were actually passed down uh, like from generation to generation. It was all done through storytelling. It was oral tradition. There's no known author uh, or other than a lot of times we can um, know which cultures that the stories may have originated from. Most are not based on any real events. However, since the stories have um, stayed around for all this time, they sometimes tell us about values or beliefs that a culture has. In other words, the folklore. All right. A lot of times, folklore and traditional literature are kind of used synonymously. And folklore does not necessarily mean something that, or it did not stop, rather, uh, at any given time because it all occurred such a very long time ago. Folklore is actually still being created. If you think maybe urban legends or jokes or stories that we settle down and tell around a campfire, different things like that, is still folklore that's being created today. Traditional literature is made up of several different types of stories, but they all have features in common, uh, possibly from being passed down through that tradition of storytelling. Uh, for example, the plots are all short and simple and direct. They all have the rising action, they all have the climax, they all have the falling action. Uh, Most traditional literature has like a closed ending. The action's pretty fast paced. It's immediate that we can tell which characters are good and which ones are bad. A lot of times the settings are really vague because we know that it happened a long time ago in a faraway land. It's always once upon a time, as in the fairy tales. Uh, the literary style always, like I said, it's closed endings. It has a start, it has an ending. It has a motif, like recurring features that happen throughout the stories. A lot of times there will be repeated refrains like, think you can't catch me, I'm the gingerbread man. Uh, there are things that you hear over and over again throughout different stories. The themes are limited in traditional literature, of course. Almost always, I can't really think of a time when it doesn't, good does eventually overcome evil, or the story does explain why, or it does teach a lesson. The endings are almost always happy because good overcomes evil. Whenever we're trying to define traditional literature, we actually call it the body of ancient stories and poems that grew out of the oral tradition of storytelling uh, before eventually being written down. Uh, we think of Grimm's fairy tales, for example, but those were simply stories that were collected by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm back in I would say probably the 18th century, and what they did was collect these stories and write them down. They didn't write the stories. Did they maybe sometimes take poetic license? And I mean, it's possible, but they collected the stories. Some of the traditional stories are told from a cultural, or it contains spiritual truths, may not contain factual elements. Pretty much all folklore is considered, is considered make-believe and not really based in real historical events. Whenever you're going through the regular PowerPoint, I hope you'll click on this link, because it is a fantastic reading of the folktale Strega Nonna by Mary Steenburgen, the actress, and she does kind of a phenomenal job of it. Know that when we are talking about folklore, that even the specialists are kind of fascinated by the similarity of all the stories throughout all the cultures. Think that when we were talking about all the different Cinderellas in class, and I brought out all the Cinderella books from different countries, they have definite plot similarities, even if they express cultural differences. Whenever we're talking about the types of traditional literature, there are some terms most commonly used that I want you to remember. For example, traditional literature itself, stories passed down by storytelling, I mentioned earlier. Folk tales used synonymously with traditional literature. Retold tales I have here because those are stories that are usually the old stories, but rewritten in a style that would appeal to more modern audiences, but remains true to the old tale. There are also a type called variants. Think the Cinderellas again, that have the basic plot similarities but differs by cultures. A lot of examples of traditional literature, of course, would be like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, Hansel and Gretel, Little Red Riding Hood. We talked about these some when you were doing your cross-cultural fairy tales. When we're talking about myths, think that these are usually always gods and goddesses, but they offer an origin storyline from multiple global creation myths. They tell how parts of the world were started. They're found very often in like Native American culture and African culture especially, but our myths that we're real familiar with like Greek gods and goddesses, or the Norwegian myths, or the Egyptian myths, and so forth, always there's that recurring theme where they are explaining the beginning of something, the origin of something. With epics and legends, think Ulysses and Beowulf from possibly your high school days. Long stories. The hero is always human, or it could be a human with superhuman characteristics, like as in Ulysses, for example. They sometimes they do deeds that could happen, but sometimes kind of have like superhuman characteristics even to their deeds. With legends, it's stories like Robin Hood, King Arthur, based on supposedly real people. Very often we think of legends as completely made up, and then as different periods of history are unearthed, we find out that it's quite possible that some of them actually did live. With folk tales, remember I mentioned the Grimm brothers, for example. These were stories that grew out of the imaginations of people over time. Folk tales and fairy tales, those terms are interchangeable. A lot of you may know what we call the fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen, but although some of his stories were stories that he collected and rewrote, a lot of his he actually wrote. So since we can contribute, or since we can attribute those to Hans Christian Andersen, they don't always necessarily fall in this category. With all of these stories, the folk tales, they used to be considered castle tales, and they would be told in gatherings in castles by the nobility. And very often, they'd make a big deal out of the fact that the heroes in them were knights and kings and so forth. But they were also told as a tale called cottage tales. And with the cottage tales, those were more for the common folk, and they kind of played up the fact that very often it was common folk that sort of ruled the day. Think the woodcutter or the woodsman or whatever in the Little Red Riding Hood stories. Think the woodsman in Hansel and Gretel, that was the father and so forth. Those were considered more the common folk. Sometimes the majority of folk tales have no magic creatures or fairies, but fairy tales should always be categorized as a type of folk tale, even if that is a characteristic of those. With cumulative tales, it's repetition, like the Little Red Hen, or I mentioned earlier the Gingerbread Man, where there is a repeating refrain, or there was an old woman who swallowed a fly. Those are all considered cumulative tales because they build on each other. The House That Jack Built is another one of those that has a rhythm to it, and has the repeated refrain. Whenever we're talking about humorous tales, there aren't an overabundance of these, but yet if you look to the Norwegian tales or Norwegian folk tales, there would probably be a whole lot more. Sometimes you will hear of stories that are referred to as noodleheads or sillies or drolls or numbskulls. They actually refer to certain kinds of stories as those, and those are the humorous tales. For example, like It Could Always Be Worse is one of those books that is very often used now to just make a point of being kind of silly. Another type of folktale category are the beast tales. Always think talking animals, overstated actions with occasional human characteristics. Whenever we're talking about these, it could be trickster tales, like the tales of Brer Rabbit and the Rabbit Tales and so forth, where they are conning someone into doing something or getting stuck in the tar or something like that. Those almost always with beast tales, it is animals acting as humans, or just talking animals, periods. And with magic, think fairy tales again, the Frog Prince, elements of magic, enchantment, fairies, witches, genies. I've got Aladdin and the Magic Lamp here, fairy godparents. Those are all considered the magic tales. There is a category called pourquoi, which for those of you who are familiar with French, know that pourquoi simply means why, and that explains like a phenomena of nature. like why the sun and moon live in the sky, why mosquitoes buzz in people's ears, how the chipmunk got his stripes. It's always answering basically why. And then there are the tall tales. They are highly exaggerated. You could even refer to those as hyperbole tales. They're highly exaggerated exploits of personal deeds. Think Paul Bunyan. Number one, how big he was, and when he dragged his axe, he created the Grand Canyon. Just total exaggerations, but really fun for kids. Whenever we're talking about the realistic tales, the characters, the plot, the setting could all actually have occurred. There's no magic. There's very little exaggeration. Only a few of these exist. Think The 100 Dresses or The Boy of the 3-Year Nap. It is possible. You know, there have been unexplained things in history where someone was in a coma for 3 years and then awoke that might very well could have led to these realistic folk tales. And then, of course, there's fables. Real simple stories, usually very short, typically animals whose actions teach us a lesson. I've got here like The Boy Who Cried Wolf. Any of Aesop's fables that you run across are the ones who have a moral to the story. They teach a lesson. Before in class, we talked about all the different kinds of Cinderellas or the cross-cultural tales. Those cross-cultural tales that we talked about and that I shared with you all, those are absolutely in this category of traditional folklore. Think on those, several of you shared different versions of Little Red Riding Hood or The Princess and the Pea or different things like that. It's the same story but coming from different cultures. And something relatively new to this category would be fractured fairy tales, which are just fun versions. Sometimes there are things put in that changes the telling of it completely, like The Falling of Rapunzel or The True Story of the Three Little Pigs, which was actually kind of groundbreaking when it came out, because all of a sudden the wolf was kind of the sympathetic character, and very much of the story was told from the wolf's point of view and so forth. But yet children still love the fractured fairy tales. This is kind of, like I said, a growing thing in traditional literature, because kids like to be introduced to the old story and then get to read it from a whole different perspective. Whenever you're going through this regular PowerPoint, the regular version of this, I hope you'll take a minute to listen to Ye Shen, Cinderella from China story. I actually shared or had the book in class, but we didn't really have time to go through it. But this is a beautiful reading of it that's done through a CBS story break, and I hope you enjoy it. It doesn't take very long to make it through it, but I hope you'll enjoy it. And then there's the questions of why would we use traditional literature even today? They're a part of our culture. They were a part of your parents' culture. They were a part of your grandparents' culture. They are a part of the storytelling tradition of man. Almost all of them teach some form of good character because you want the good guy to win. They teach some form of principles. You have to be Principled, you have to have a plan, you have to be brave, you know, in order to win out at the end. There are life lessons in there, like don't cry wolf too often. It engaged students in stories, like I said, that they have in common even with their grandparents or great-grandparents. We can explore older versions of it from our past. We mentioned in face-to-face classes how different the original Grimm's fairy tales were to the Disney versions of what we see today. A lot of times, just through reading these, we learn a little bit about other cultures, or we understand a little bit more about other cultures because we read about stories that they have of why things happened in the first place. Anyway, it's a wonderful category. It's one that I'm sure you're going to be sharing with your students a lot. And it's one that I really hope that you enjoy the books that I bring into class to share with you this week. Have a good week.